The Arctic Circle, January 2025. In the vast, breathless silence of the Arctic night, where time itself seems buried beneath layers of eternal frost, a single flicker pierced the void, a tiny pulse, blinking on the thermal display of NORAD's remote monitoring station, like a heartbeat lost in the wilderness of white. It pulsed in and out, ghost-like, defiant, embedded deep in the snow-blind expanse of permafrost. The AO-77 military satellite had just transmitted a cascade of anomalous signals, intermittent, discordant, interlaced with image data that, to the trained eyes of the analysts, whispered of something profoundly unnatural. No storm, no tectonic event, no known machine. The analysts leaned closer, their faces lit by the pale glow of the monitor, exchanging looks that said more than words could manage. In over a decade of scanning the Arctic, nothing had ever looked like this. "What the hell is that?" a young officer breathed, eyes locked on the contoured shape hidden more than 60 meters beneath the ice, a metal silhouette with rounded edges, an elongated body nearly 70 meters long, both ends sealed like ancient secrets, and a pronounced dorsal ridge that unmistakably recalled the ghost of a forgotten submarine. 3 days of cross-referencing and repeated scans followed, each one carving deeper into the mystery, until a conclusion, like a fault line cracking through history, emerged from the cold. Why 2025, a German submarine lost in 1943. Far away in Boston, within the hallowed stillness of the Institute for Deep Sea Archaeology, Dr. Elias Granger stood silently before a scale model of the Titanic, his hand resting upon the vessel's hull, as though listening for echoes from the past. He was a man who spoke the language of forgotten things, a scholar of clandestine wars and buried machines, whose work had taken him from sunken dreadnoughts beneath scorched desert sands to vanished aircraft in jungle tombs. Then the silence fractured. A call from the Pentagon broke through the veil of reverie, crackling with the weight of urgency. A voice, measured, grave, cut through without ceremony. "We need you. Now 2025 has surfaced." Elias exhaled, slow and heavy, as though the past had reached up to seize him by the collar. His eyes drifted, not in disbelief, but into the mist-shrouded chambers of memory. "That's impossible," he murmured. "Why, 2025 was a legend." Within the heart of a classified military intelligence center, a conference room cloaked in secrecy buzzed faintly with the cold light of tactical screens. The air was taut, thick with unspoken fears. And into that room walked Elias Granger, hair silvered by time, eyes dark with things seen and endured. Waiting for him were 2 others. Dr. Ava Kingsley, an Arctic biologist with eyes sharp as broken ice and a calm that masked a relentless mind, and Lieutenant Marcus Delaney, a Special Forces veteran whose left cheek bore the faded memory of war in the shape of a scar. "This isn't a standard excavation, Doctor." "Granger," said the colonel, his voice brittle with tension. "The Y-2025 vanished during a black classified operation. No distress call, no trace. And now it's surfaced, intact, beneath the ice. We need a team that can investigate this without shaking the world apart." The screen flared with a rotating 3D model, cold metal encased in ancient ice, each rivet and groove untouched by time. But it was the thermal data that drew Ava's brow into a frown. The strange curvature of the heat signature, almost imperceptible. But there, a dull glow, as if something still stirred inside. "Surface temperatures are -40, she said quietly. "But near the hull, residual heat, possible biological activity can't be ruled out." Marcus's eyes narrowed, fingers tapping the grip of his holstered weapon. "Then whatever this is, it never died, or was never allowed to sleep." A military transport plane tore through the cloud-thick sky over Alaska, its engines straining against the wind like a beast trying to outrun time itself. Inside, Elias sat by the window, watching the frozen sun skim the horizon with an expression lost somewhere between dread and awe. Beside him, Ava reviewed what little remained of the Y-2025's classified files, pages redacted to the bone, and Marcus, silent, methodical, cleaned his sidearm with the ritual of a man too familiar with death, not out of fear, but memory. When the aircraft descended onto the Polaris staging station, Elias stepped onto the ice for the first time in nearly 20 years. The cold clawed through his protective suit, but it wasn't the wind that chilled him. It was the palpable sensation that history itself was beginning to rise from its icy grave. Before them stretched a world without color, a sky the color of steel, antenna towers trembling in the wind, and an endless sheet of snow that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere. A Norwegian officer approached and handed Marcus a tracking device. "We don't go near it anymore," he said flatly, "but the dogs won't leave. They just stay. They call them the Nameless Sentinels." Elias blinked. "Dogs?" The officer nodded. "Not strays. Canines, trained, tagged, serial numbers tattooed on their necks, as if they belonged to a unit." Ava's eyes turned to Elias, the curiosity gone, replaced by something colder, intuition. "Project Fenrir K9? Elias didn't answer, but within the haunted halls of his mind, a name stirred. Fenrir, the wolf of Norse myth, born to guard the end of days. As Arctic night fell like a curtain, a single transport helicopter surged toward the fracture beneath the ice, its cargo a scholar, a scientist, and a soldier. Beneath them, the lost vessel lay in silence, swallowed for nearly a century. Around it, tracks that had never faded, footsteps that had no end. The chopper's blades sliced through snow-thick fog, descending toward a makeshift landing pad. Elias disembarked first, his gaze sweeping across a barren expanse where nothing lived, only wind and ice, and the heavy imprint of something old that refused to be forgotten. Ava followed, notebook clenched, eyes scanning every crack, every curve of ice for a sign the earth had moved. And Marcus came last, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, not out of need, but habit. The kind of habit that only comes from walking the edge of death. Their camp stood 300 meters from the wreck. That very night, Elias sat alone in the command tent, the dim glow of radar screens and declassified war maps flickering around him. The original 1943 patrol routes had been reconstructed, faded, and incomplete, but he read them like a man reading ghost stories etched in blood. Something was wrong. The Y-2025's trajectory didn't align with Atlantic patrols. It had deviated, deliberately. Not a military strategy, not evasion, a search. It had been looking for something. Ava sat beside him, her gloved fingers delicately turning the brittle pages of a faded dossier, the kind that carried the scent of dust and secrets. Her voice was low, nearly swallowed by the cold. "Look at this line. An entry from the journal of a submarine engineer, Emil Klosser, written in October of 1943. We don't know where we're going, only that the orders came from the very top. Even our commanding officer wasn't allowed to ask questions." Elias nodded slowly, his breath curling into white tendrils in the frigid air, as if the truth itself had been exhaled. "Then it's exactly what I feared," he murmured. "This wasn't a naval operation. This was something else." That night, as the wind whispered like old ghosts across the Arctic plain, the temporary radar station swept the area surrounding the submarine's frozen tomb. Ava, seated before the thermal imaging monitor, froze mid-scan. Something blinked in the northern quadrant. Movement. brief, calculated, then gone again like breath on glass. "Elias," she whispered, not daring to raise her voice. "We've got motion." Elias leaned forward, eyes narrowing. There it was, a soft arc of orange snaking around the hull. It wasn't an animal. The path was too deliberate, too restrained. Nor was it human. There was no steady body heat, no sign of breath. It moved like a phantom on patrol, cloaked in silence too deep to be natural. Marcus stepped into the tent, his entrance casting a flicker of shadow across the data screens, the overhead lamp catching the pale scar across his left cheek. "I just finished a sweep," he said, voice low. "Didn't see anything, but—" He paused, eyes darkening. It felt like something saw me. Ava's gaze remained on the screen. "It's circling us, not closing in, not retreating, watching." By morning, the sky had soured to a deeper gray, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. The team began their approach toward the wreck. The ice beneath their boots was dense, solid like marble, yet it bore cracks, thin and wandering, like the footprints of time. Not fresh, not new, but recent enough to unsettle. Elias dropped to one knee, brushing frost away from what first seemed like a deformity in the surface. But then he saw it, clear as a fossil in stone, a footprint, large, arched, with sharp claw ridges and deep heel impressions, a shepherd's gait. But it wasn't the paw print that stole his breath. It was what lay beside it, a length of steel chain, rusted and stiff with age, and on it, barely visible, the faded outline of a coded marking, FK 903. He turned to Ava, his voice hoarse. "Project Fenrir K9 isn't a theory. They were here, and they might still be." Ava didn't speak. She simply lifted her gaze, slowly, almost unwillingly, toward the icy ridge across the distance, and there, still as death, stood a figure. Dark, tall, a silhouette carved in black fur and cold wind. A German shepherd. Towering. Head high, spine straight, eyes blazing with silent intelligence. It didn't bark, it didn't move, it simply watched. Later that afternoon, Elias returned to the tent, the cold following him like a shadow. He spent hours poring over a faded reproduction of the journal of Captain Franz Albrecht, a partial copy extracted from declassified wartime archives. Each line trembled in his hands like prophecy. "We were ordered not to stop, not to ask, not to report. We sailed toward encrypted coordinates beneath the white sea of ice. I don't know what lies there, but once we passed 85 degrees north, our instruments began to fail. The compass spun. Radios fell silent. And there was a sound beneath the hull, like breathing." Elias turned the last page. His fingers trembled, not from cold, but the weight of history pressing back. "November 2nd, 1943. We saw them. Not men, not beasts. Eyes glowing, waiting in the dark. They didn't attack, they didn't leave. They waited. That night the radar scanned again, but this time it wasn't a single anomaly. It was 5. Ava stared at the readings, her voice barely audible, as though afraid sound itself might awaken something. "They're multiplying, and it looks like they've surrounded the wreck." Marcus reached for his weapon, but Elias raised a hand and placed it gently on the soldier's shoulder, shaking his head. "Not to strike," he said. "To stand watch. We're not being threatened. We're being warned." Outside, the wind wailed like a forgotten lullaby, threading through cracks in the ice like the breath of something ancient. And in the heavy blackness beyond the tents, they began to appear. Pairs of eyes glowing in absolute stillness, not close enough to touch, not far enough to ignore, watching, waiting, as if guiding the intruders not to danger, but to a truth humanity was never meant to find. Elias Granger closed the old journal with hands that trembled not from the cold, but from the clarity of what he now understood. That every step they took forward was not merely an expedition, but a collision course with memories the world had buried, yet never laid to rest. At dawn, under a sky frozen into shades of slate and silence, they departed the research outpost. 6 tracked snow vehicles, heavy and low to the ground, carried drilling gear, mobile weather stations, and most of all, men and women bearing questions for which history had never written answers. Elias rode in the lead cabin, eyes fixed beyond the frost-laced window, as if searching for something he'd already seen in a dream. Ava sat across from him, clutching a fresh satellite map, marking survey points with steady precision. Marcus, silent as always, checked weapons, tested radios, but said nothing. Outside, the wind howled in pulses, primal and unrelenting like the roar of a world before humanity. The path they carved into the wilderness had no name, no trees, no birds, no sound but snow and silence. By late afternoon, they pitched camp in a vast, frozen valley less than 12 kilometers from the wreck. 4 specialized tents were arranged in a crescent, the command tent at the center, humming faintly with radar signals and thermal scans. Elias remained bent over the map, fingers tracing a dim outline in the bottom right corner. A forgotten mark from a 1943 military chart. Strategic exclusion zone. High-level biological clearance required. No one ever explained why that designation existed, he muttered. There was no satellite intel back then. And yet somehow, they knew this place wasn't meant to be touched. Ava looked up, her voice thoughtful, not skeptical. Or maybe they didn't want anyone else to know what they touched. Night falls fast in the Arctic. At 2:17 a.m., Ava was the first to wake. It wasn't wind, it wasn't shifting snow, it was breathing, low, guttural, faintly wheezing through the fabric of the tent wall. As if something stood just inches away, its nose pressed to the nylon, drawing in her scent. She unzipped the tent slowly, almost reverently, as if the act itself might summon whatever it was that had been waiting out there all night. Stepping out, her boots sank deep into the thick Arctic snow, the cold biting into her ankles like teeth, while the wind lashed across her face, not like a breeze, but like blades drawn by unseen hands. Still, Ava stood perfectly still, her breath shallow, ears straining against the howl of the wind. Something was moving. Not far off, just beyond the edge of the encampment, under the sickly, wavering light of the outpost lamps, she saw it. A footprint, bold and heavy, stamped cleanly into the frozen crust. Then another, and another. She knelt down slowly, her gloved fingers hovering above the mark. A dog's paw print. But not just any dog. It was massive, unmistakably defined. Strong pads, deep claws, the arch precise and unwavering. She had studied hundreds of species adapted to snow, tracked beasts across polar tundras, and cataloged their every print. But this one belonged to only one type of animal, a military German shepherd. Canine class, the kind bred and trained for warfare. Ava turned sharply, her voice cracking the silence. "Marcus! Elias!" Marcus was on his feet in under 3 seconds, weapon ready. Elias stumbled out from the adjacent tent, eyes still blinking against the glare of his headlamp. Ava pointed toward the snow, her voice steady but low. "You see this? That's not a stray, that's a canine. This is Project Fenrir." The 3 of them circled the tracks in silence, the prints forming a wide arc that encircled the camp with chilling precision. No scatter, no hesitation. The path was clean, deliberate, as if it were a patrol route. Marcus muttered, "How many?" Ava scanned the snow, her breath slow, her thoughts racing. 8 different sets, maybe more. But this wasn't a wild pack. They moved with intent, tactical formation, like a unit. Elias stared out into the pale blur of the Arctic beyond, saying nothing. But in the silence between them, his heart already understood what his lips refused to voice. These creatures were not here by chance. They had come for the ship, and for what lay sleeping inside. When the Arctic sun finally rose, a slash of cold gold bleeding across the ice, they returned to the command tent. The thermal radar had captured the movements from the night before. 8 signals circling the camp, always stopping just at the edge, never once crossing the line. Ava zoomed in on the trajectory. Look at this pattern. That's not hunting behavior. That's a patrol route. Elias flipped open the captain's declassified logbook. We've been watched since the second night. No shadows, only tracks come morning. They never come aboard, only circle. But precise, predictable, like sentries. That afternoon, one of the recon vehicles failed, its engine stalling roughly 2 kilometers from base. Marcus and a young engineer named Theo were sent to assist. But when they arrived, they found something stranger than a breakdown. On the frosted windshield, dusted like breath on glass, was a single claw mark. Diagonal. Deliberate. Not damage, but a sign. Marcus scanned the empty white. Nothing. But a deep, visceral sense wrapped around his chest, an instinct older than language, that someone or something wanted them to know it was there. And it was watching. That night, as the wind screamed over the canvas and the cold turned blood to stone, Ava sat alone beside the tent, the flickering station light casting shadows across her face. She flipped through grainy photographs from 1943, pulled from long-buried military archives, one of them showing, barely visible, 6 German shepherds standing at attention before the submarine. Y-2025. Eyes sharp, spine straight. Each wore a leather collar, stamped with cold precision, FK 901-02-03. Her fingers brushed the photograph. Outside, in the deathly silence of a night that remembered too much, she knew they were still out there, those 4-legged shadows, patrolling as they always had, as if they had never left their posts since that fateful day, over 80 years ago. She sat in stillness, her heart slowing to a rhythm that felt less like her own and more like an echo, an ancient pulse beating from a time long past. From her jacket, she withdrew a small encryption key, temporary clearance, level 4, issued by NORAD for the expedition. She slotted it into the handheld decoder and typed the phrase, Project Fenrir K9. The screen flickered. Much of the data was redacted, blacked out like memories too dangerous to recall, but what remained chilled her deeper than the wind ever could. Project Fenrir K9, initiated, 1941. Commander, Colonel Eric Lang, SS Sonderdivision. Objective, develop a specialized K9 unit trained to guard ultra-classified assets of scientific value beyond current human comprehension. Ava read each line slowly, the words heavy with meaning. Then came the behavior report excerpt. Subjects selected not only for strength and navigational skill, but for memory retention, capable of following complex combat directives for years without retraining. Final command. Do not retreat. Do not abandon post. Do not disobey the protection order. This was conditioned into reflex through extreme behavioral programming. Thus, Fenrir became the only unit capable of Omega-level asset protection, without a living commander. Then came the line that stole the air from her lungs. Units FK9-01 through FK9-12 were deployed with submarine Y-2025 in October 1943. Objective, guard unidentified artifact, classification, beyond human threat. She didn't move. Outside, the wind picked up again, this time accompanied by soft, almost imperceptible scraping, as if something padded lightly along the edge of the tent. But Ava wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She understood, at least in some primal part of herself, that they were not here to harm. They were still keeping a promise, a vow forged in the dark, sealed in obedience, and held across decades that had forgotten them. The next morning, Elias called Ava into the command tent. "I want you to see this." He pointed to a black and white photograph. 6 German soldiers standing rigid, expressionless. At their feet, German shepherds, still as statues, not loyal, waiting for orders. "This photo," Elias said, his voice tinged with reverence and something colder, "was retrieved from the SS archives, dated 1943. Look closely. What do you see?" Ava leaned over, her eyes scanning the grainy image as if searching for a voice hidden behind the static of time. She pointed, slowly, to the collar of one of the creatures captured in black and white. Embossed marking, FK 901. "Exactly," Elias whispered, as if that single code carried the weight of everything they feared to confirm. "And this is the translated section from the latter half of Captain Albrecht's journal, the part I finished decoding last night." He unfolded a faded photocopy, its ink smudged by age and the trembling hands that had once penned it. "Fenrir are not ordinary dogs. They do not bark. They do not play. They were born to guard. They sleep when unnecessary and awaken the moment we draw near the containment vault. I've begun to wonder, do they understand what they're protecting? Better than we do?" Ava clenched her gloved fist, a chill running deeper than skin. "I think Fenrir 01 is still alive." At that moment, Marcus entered the tent, his expression dark and contemplative, his eyes carrying the weight of something freshly disturbed. "We just came back from a recon sweep of the western perimeter, found new prints. The ice is soft there, fresh layer, but the indentations are deep, evenly spaced. Precisely 300 meters from camp, half-circle formation, and beside them, signs of digging." Elias froze mid-thought. "Digging? Searching for what?" Marcus met his gaze with unsettling steadiness. "I'm not sure. But here's what matters. Every footprint was canine. No human prints. None." That afternoon, the snow began to fall. Not in flurries, but in a soft, grainy drift, like powdered salt scattered from the hands of something ancient. Ava made her way to the site of the dig. Kneeling slowly, she brushed back the snow with her gloved hand, revealing a shallow depression in the ice, and beneath that, a collar. Leather, dark with time and half-crusted with frost, but still intact, and engraved upon it, unmistakably, FK 901. She lifted it with a reverence usually reserved for sacred relics, her breath caught somewhere between grief and awe. There was something in her chest, an ache, wordless and tender, that felt like mourning, but also respect. These creatures hadn't needed commands. They hadn't awaited orders. They had chosen to remain. From that frozen night in 1943 until now. That evening, beneath the humming lantern light of the command tent, Elias opened Albrecht's journal again. One final passage remained, an echo across 8 decades, a whisper from the brink. "I hear them pacing every night. No one commands them, no one calls. They don't need us. But they know. We need them. I'm beginning to believe that when the world forgets, only Fenrir remembers." Ava murmured from her corner, eyes gleaming with something unspoken. "And they're still here, not just guarding artifacts. They're guarding memory, oaths, and something we've never been ready to face." Outside, where snow and silence wove a world apart, a shadow moved. 4 legs, no sound, no warning. Just the weight of a single step, following a trail it had never stopped walking. 80 years of vigilance. Fenrir had never left its post. And perhaps it never would. The next morning the team departed before the light had a chance to breathe through the overcast sky. Most of the heavier equipment was left behind, replaced with only what was essential: handheld scanners, a portable radar array, and 3 backup firearms. The Arctic sun, veiled behind a wall of dense cloud, cast no warmth, no guidance. It hovered like a ghost swallowed by storm, and the world below fell into a haze of silver and silence, where even the wind felt like it was holding its breath. The snow vehicles moved slowly, their treads rumbling over the ice like the heartbeat of something vast and buried beneath. The sound was low, guttural, as though the ocean of ice beneath them had begun to murmur. Elias sat in the front cabin, hands interlocked, his eyes staring ahead, unblinking, unwavering, as if each meter forward brought him closer not just to the wreck, but to something buried inside himself. Ava sat just behind him, her eyes glued to the radar screen, where orange pulses marked topography and ice strata. But at the heart of the display, precisely where the submarine should be, there was a void. Black, empty. No return, as if the technology, in its cold logic, simply refused to look there, as if something beneath the ice had erased its own shadow. Coordinates: 86 degrees, 14 minutes north, 41 degrees, 39 minutes east. At exactly 11:37 a.m., they stopped. Before them stretched a plain of pure ice, so flat, so unblemished, it could have been mistaken for glass fogged by the breath of centuries. But at the center, jutting from the white like the rib of some prehistoric beast, rose a dark, frozen mass, half submerged, half emerged, a silhouette like the corpse of a leviathan trying to breathe through the crust of eternity. By 2025. The submarine lay there in haunting stillness, entombed but untouched, a monument to a war that had never ended, a coffin not yet closed. Time had failed to erode it. The cold had not broken it. It stood, whole and waiting. Elias stepped forward first, his breath uneven, his hands trembling, not from the Arctic wind, but from something far colder. Awe. Not a single dent, he whispered. No signs of collision. The hull, it's nearly pristine, like it never left the shipyard. Ava reached out, laying her hand on the icy metal. It was freezing, but not lifeless. There was something beneath the surface, some pulse, slow and ancient, that hadn't yet exhaled its final breath. Marcus, meanwhile, didn't look at the submarine. He was watching the horizon, and then he saw it. The wind shifted, pulling the fog into thick drapes across the valley. Ava turned, sensing the change, and caught Marcus staring into the distance, his hand slowly lowering toward his holster, not in panic, but in instinct. "What is it?" she asked softly. Marcus didn't speak. He took one step forward, then another. His boots crunched through the crusted snow, each movement deliberate, cautious. Then he raised his hand, pointing. Ava turned. And there it was. A figure. Four-legged. Motionless. Standing in the mist like a sentinel from another age. It did not move. It did not flinch. Its ears stood tall, and its posture was carved from stone. A German shepherd stood before them, large, powerfully built, its coat a dark cascade of black threaded with hints of silver, like moonlight trapped in midnight fur. But what stopped Ava cold, what stole the air from her lungs, was not its size or posture. It was the eyes. Gold. Unblinking. Still as a frozen lake, yet cutting through her with a precision that bypassed flesh and bone to reach the trembling center of her heart, like a blade that didn't pierce skin but carved silence into the soul. Elias moved beside her, his steps slow, uncertain, as though he were approaching not a creature but a memory long buried. And then he stopped. Fenrir-01, he whispered, the name escaping his lips as if he had never believed he'd speak it aloud again. Ava turned to him, her voice low but urgent. How do you know that name? There was a pause, long enough for the wind to rise around them like a warning, before Elias replied, his voice wrapped in awe and dread. Because I've seen it before, in a photograph that was never meant to be seen. It was the leader, the first to be trained without a handler, the prototype for the entire project, and it was never officially recorded as deceased. The dog didn't move. But there was no doubt in its stillness. It knew they were there. It had known for some time. Not aggressive, not afraid, merely present in a way that felt almost sovereign, as if its existence had fused with the very mission it was born to uphold. A sentry who had stayed so long, it had become part of what it guarded. Ava stepped forward gently, as if every sound might shatter the fragile air stretched between them. It doesn't bark, doesn't growl, doesn't attack. Because it knows we're not a threat, Elias said quietly, but the moment we cross the line... Marcus finished the thought, his voice like gravel. It will do what it was programmed to do. Protect. At all costs. A sudden gust swept across the wreck, snow swirling like smoke, and then Fenrir-01 turned, not with fear or retreat, but with the calm assurance of something that had always known its next step. It walked, not hurried, not hesitant, but with the measured grace of a guide, not leaving, but leading. It moved around the far side of the ship's hull and stopped, waiting. Ava looked to Elias, uncertain. It wants us to follow? Elias answered without looking at her, eyes locked on the still form of the creature. Not because it needs us, but because it thinks the time has come for us to understand. So they followed. The ice beneath their boots creaked faintly, sharp, brittle notes echoing like footsteps through time. Mist curled around their legs, but it could not obscure Fenrir's path. Each paw print was perfect, deliberate, as though pressed into the snow by a ritual repeated every day for 80 years. They came to a narrow fracture in the ice, a rift unregistered by any radar sweep. Fenrir-01 stood at its edge, eyes still fixed on Elias. Down there, Ava hesitated, her voice trembling on the edge of something vast. Elias stepped forward, knelt, and shone his flashlight into the crack. Beneath the ice, buried almost completely, was a small steel hatch, cold and ancient, its surface etched with the faint, ghostly marks of old German script. Sonderlager. Do not open, do not break. Beneath lies what mankind must not possess. Elias placed a hand gently on the freezing metal, a reverent touch that knew what it was brushing against. This isn't part of the wreck. This is a vault, and Fenrir was ordered to protect it, no matter the cost. The dog didn't react. But in its eyes, in the stillness of its body, there was something deeper than threat. There was waiting, not an ultimatum, a crossroad, a fracture between truth and choice. You stayed, Elias whispered, almost to himself. You stayed here for 80 years, just to make sure no one ever opened this. Behind him, Ava's voice was quiet, almost broken. So, if we open it, what happens to the world? Elias said nothing. Because even he, the man who had stood at the edge of death sites forgotten by history, could not say he was ready to know. Fenrir-01 stood in the snow, unmoved, its breath slow, visible in the cold, watching, guarding, and in some inexplicable way, forgiving. If only mankind knew when to turn back, the crossroad had arrived. The question was no longer, can we open it? But should we? Elias stepped back, not out of fear, but because he felt something no satellite, no map, no textbook could measure. A boundary not marked by coordinates, but by conscience. A line invisible yet undeniable, where human will brushed against the outer edge of morality, and found itself being judged by something no longer entirely of this world. Fenrir 01 turned once more, stepping lightly into the mist, its paw prints etched in the snow like a message left for the living. Ava watched, her eyes wet with something she could not name. "We have to know," she said, "not just to unlock history, but to understand why they're still here, guarding what humanity chose to forget." Elias didn't respond with words, but he nodded, not in agreement, but in surrender. Because now, there was no turning back. Back at camp, the team initiated a full georadar sweep of the terrain surrounding the wreck. They deployed ground-penetrating radar, GPR, slicing through layers of time compressed into strata, each level of ice a record, a frozen timestamp carved by the Earth's breath. Helena, Ava's assistant, leaned close to the monitor as the first results came in. "Oh my God," she murmured, barely audible. Elias approached. The screen showed closed, concentric curves, patrol loops, again and again, overlapping with such precision they resembled the inner workings of a colossal clock that had ticked in silence for 8 decades. Marcus frowned. "No way. Those are the same tracks? How many layers?" "At least 70, Helena replied. "Each one matches a winter, a year." Ava pointed at the data. "Every year, a new loop. But what's strange, none of them overlap randomly. They match. Perfectly." Elias sank into a chair, his hands tightening slowly. They walked the same path. No deviation, no error, from one generation to the next. The following day, they drilled deeper, into the ice from the year 1963. And there, like a memory preserved in glass, was a footprint. Deep, sharp, unmistakable. Ava crouched, placing her hand gently atop the frozen print. It was large, clear, and identical to the print she had measured just days earlier, the one belonging to Fenrir 01. "This can't be," she whispered. "No dog lives that long." Elias looked at her. His eyes didn't blink. "Unless they're not just dogs." That night, as sleep settled over the camp and silence curled around the tents like a blanket of frost, the radar pinged again. Motion. Ava was the first to wake. She threw off the covers and turned on the screen. Patrol paths. Again. But this time, something had changed. She zoomed in slowly, her breath catching in her throat as the image sharpened. Not into clarity, but into mystery. There it was, unmistakable in its singularity, a footprint, strange and unfamiliar, unlike the known patterns etched into the snow from previous nights. It appeared alone, at the outer edge of the restricted zone. It did not return the way it came. It simply stopped, as if something had stepped forward and never looked back. Fenrir 01, or had another generation begun? The next morning, beneath a sky too pale to be trusted, Elias led Ava and Marcus back to the fracture site, the same place where, just a day before, the sealed steel door had rested in stillness like a heartbeat long stopped. But now, Fenrir 01 was gone. In its place, surrounding the heavy steel hatch, was a new pattern in the snow, an unbroken patrol circle, evenly spaced, perfectly measured. No irregularities, no hesitation, a deliberate ritualistic path, as though someone or something had walked the long night to complete a final rite. Ava knelt without a word. Silence blanketed the air like snowfall. She pressed her gloved hand into one of the fresh prints. It was warmer, sharper, still vibrating faintly in the wind, like a pulse not yet stilled. "They're not just walking," she whispered. "They're remembering. Once a year, every year, they rebuild memory with their bodies, with their steps, with their breath." Elias looked at her, voice cracking with something deeper than words. To make sure the world never forgets. Later that afternoon, the scout team uncovered a fragment of dried hide, half buried in the ice at the valley's edge. On its surface, faded but unmistakable, was a trace of paint, FK 911. No longer whole, but enough to know a previous generation had fallen here. Marcus's voice was low, reverent. They died. But the mission didn't. Ava nodded, her gaze distant, steady. And the next took their place. Same path, same circle, same oath. Night fell. They sat together around a small ring of electric lamps planted in the snow, each face lit with a soft glow that did little to push back the cold, but enough to remind them they were still human, still here. No one spoke. For a long while, silence became its own kind of language. It was Elias who finally broke it, his voice hollow but alive with something new. "I used to believe that archaeology was about uncovering the past," he said, eyes unfocused. "But now I know. Some memories don't live in books. They live in footsteps, in gazes, in living beings who chose not to forget." Ava turned away, blinking fast, though whether from the cold or something deeper, even she didn't know. "Fenrir 01 didn't survive 80 years, she said softly. "It was passed on, from eye to eye, from paw to paw, like bloodline, like duty." And beyond the warm circle of lamplight, in the hushed snowfall that shimmered like breath turned to ash, the shadows began to move once more, four-legged sentinels pacing through the dark. No words, no sound, no end. A circle, silent, unbroken, alive, like the quiet heart of something sacred that humanity once held dear and lost. The morning rose in eerie stillness. Not a breeze stirred, not a whisper moved across the endless plains of frost. The ice lay smooth and flat as glass, unblemished, as if the night before, with all its footprints, its movements, its memories, had never existed. Only a silence remained. A silence so absolute it felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Elias stood at the ice's edge, eyes fixed on the monolith rising from the deep. Why 2025, the lost submarine, the final trace of a mission history had never dared to speak aloud. 3 engineering teams moved into position, their machines hissing and clicking against the cold. Thermal drills, stratified ice cutters, seismic sensors, all erected around the hull like the tools of surgeons operating on a body long frozen in time. Under the precise coordination of Ava and Marcus, layer by layer, the icy tomb was peeled away. What had once been sealed in myth was now unfolding before them, not as wreckage, but as revelation. And then it was there, fully exposed. The submarine stood nearly untouched by time. No cracks, no breaches, no evidence of battle or storm or error. Elias approached, slow and reverent, his gloved hands trembling as they reached out to brush against the cold steel of the hull. Though flecked with age, the body remained intact, smooth, undistorted, resolute, painted along the flank, faded but still legible, Y 2025, Kriegsmarine. He stepped back, eyes wide, voice quiet as snowfall. "It wasn't sunk," he said. "Not by failure, not by pursuit." Ava's voice barely rose above the wind. "Then why did it stop here? And why? Did no one ever leave?" Elias turned his gaze toward the hatch. where the technical crew was preparing hydraulic pressure to crack the final seal. "Maybe," he said. "They were never allowed to." It wasn't until late afternoon that the hatch gave way. A sharp clack, like the closing of a book no one had finished reading, echoed through the valley. The heavy steel door groaned open, a rush of air spilled out, dense and moist, thick with the rot of years that had never touched sunlight. It smelled of iron, of time, of memory. Marcus entered first, flashlight slicing through the darkness. The beam ran over rusted pipes, faded gauges, ancient control panels, until it came to rest upon the command deck. Elias followed, and froze. They were still there. Each one. Every one. Frozen, but whole. The entire crew, at least 27 men, still seated at their posts, hands resting on controls, eyes either closed in slumber or left open to eternity. No one had collapsed, no one had fled, no signs of struggle, only stillness. Ava stepped in behind them, hand covering her mouth. "Oh my God." She approached one figure, perhaps the navigator. His hand was still on the compass dial, his expression peaceful, not twisted in fear, not clenched in pain. It looked as though he had simply drifted off. Elias knelt by the nearest body. He touched the collar of the uniform, then shone a light across the man's face. No decay, no trauma, no sign of poison or suffocation. "No biological response," Elias murmured. "No defensive reaction. Nothing that explains why they died." Ava touched the radar screen, still faintly lit despite the power source long expired. "I've seen frozen bodies before," she whispered. "Natural cryopreservation in the Andes. But this isn't that. This looks like they fell asleep an hour ago." Then Marcus raised his light. And they saw it, carved into the inner hull, ragged and desperate. "Do not open. We were wrong. Forgive us." Silence fell. Elias read the words aloud, voice cracking. "We were wrong." He exhaled long and slow, then looked out at the motionless figures, still adorned with names now worn by snow and time. Schmidt, Hauer, Klosser, Albrecht. But in the very center of the submarine, on the captain's chair where command should have reigned, there was only emptiness. Ava swept her flashlight across the dim rear of the vessel. "Where's the command deck?" Elias rose slowly, his eyes shadowed with something heavier than thought. "Maybe he died somewhere else." And so they stood there, unmoving, in the paralyzing cold of a chamber suspended in time, surrounded by men who had not fallen, but remained upright, locked in place, frozen not just by the ice but by duty, by orders that had never been rescinded. No one had left their post. No one had broken the chain of command. Elias reached out and laid his hand gently on the back of one of the sailors. "I don't know what you saw, or what you were asked to guard, but I hope, at the very least, that you found peace." But deep down, he knew those words weren't entirely true, because if the patrols outside still walked their silent circles, then perhaps, just perhaps, the mission hadn't ended. Not in the hearts of men, but in memory. In the dogs. In the inherited silence of creatures who had never disobeyed a single command. In the blackened depth of U-Boat Y, 2025, where life had stopped but time had not yet withdrawn, a chill slid up Ava's neck, like the whisper of a forgotten thought. She turned. Nothing. But somewhere beyond, in the white roar of fog that coiled outside the hull, came a breath. Deep, long, resonant, as if drawn not from lungs but from memory itself. And Ava knew. They hadn't just found the ship. The ship had found them. The captain's quarters were sealed behind a rusted iron door, locked in by a thick wall of ice, as if even the air had been forbidden to enter. It took the team nearly 3 hours of controlled thermal cutting and careful drilling to melt the years away, until finally the ancient door gave way with a groan, like the sound of time breaking open. Elias was the first to step in. He paused at the threshold, not from fear, but as if reluctant to disturb the stillness, an almost sacred quiet that clung to the small room, no larger than a monk's cell, a space meant for one life, or one death. At the center stood a wooden desk, warped slightly by age but still intact, and on it, placed with reverence, untouched, lay a weathered leather journal beside an inverted Luger pistol, barrel down, as though turned away in final restraint. There was no body, no blood, only silence, as pure and overwhelming as prayer. Ava entered behind him, her flashlight illuminating the yellowed pages. Elias lifted the journal in both hands, as if he were holding an artifact pulled from beneath history itself. The embossed name on the cover was still faintly visible. Franz Albrecht, Kapitänleutnant, U-Boot Y-2025. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was strong, meticulous, spanning each line with the control of a man accustomed to order. October 4th, 1943. We have received orders to depart Kiel. No route disclosed, no response to any transmission. Destination: encrypted coordinates in the Arctic Circle. No explanation, no questions permitted. Elias read slowly, each word pressing into his chest, like a weight rediscovered. October 12th, 1943. Compass deviation has begun. Instruments unstable. Strange lights on the ice. Movement at night. Patterns we cannot trace. No clear sightings. Orders remain. Proceed forward. Ava clenched her hand as Elias turned to the next page. The writing began to shift. Faster, sharper, as though the author were struggling to stay balanced between clarity and encroaching fear. October 18th, 1943. Schmidt requested permission to inspect a fracture near the starboard hull. He didn't return, but by morning, his footprints remained. One direction. No blood, no cries, no scratches, but beside his prints were claw marks. Large, not wolf, not bear. I'm beginning to believe something is watching us, waiting, not hunting, not moving close, just standing, guarding. Ava looked at Elias, and in her eyes was a grief too complex for a name. Fear, yes, but also a kind of awe, and beneath it all, a thread of sorrow. We're walking into a loneliness no one ever returned from, she whispered. Elias nodded slowly, then turned another page. The paper was damp, but the writing remained legible. October 24th, 1943. We have found the artifact, a black stone chest, seamless, no hinges, no lock, and yet it is warm. Even in -40 degrees it radiates heat. When I touched it, I heard something, not sound, thought, as if something touched back. I ordered it sealed. No one slept that night. Marcus, standing at the hatch, murmured, "This is where the collapse began." Elias said nothing. October 28th, 1943. Fenrir has not moved from the artifact. All 6. They do not sleep, they do not eat. They stand, silent, forming a circle. I no longer approach. There is something inside it. Something they understand more than I ever could. They are not dogs. They are the memory's hand, the guardians of a structure older than us all. The final page. The handwriting now trembled, ink smeared, as though written with hands unsteady in the final hours. November 2nd, 1943. I have ordered the vessel sealed. We are not leaving. Fuel is gone. The radio is dead. But that no longer matters. They are waiting. Not wolves, not dogs. Fenrir does not leave. We are the error, and I leave this as my last entry for whoever finds it. Do not open the chest. Let them guard it. Because if the door opens, what is imprisoned is not merely a thing. It is a fragment of mankind's memory, one we were never meant to remember. Elias closed the journal with both hands, and for a long time said nothing. Ava sat down beside him, the cold of the submarine's long, dead breath seeping through the metal walls and into their bones. Around them, the silence was sacred and heavy, not empty, but full, like the hush that follows a final prayer. Here, in this frozen chamber where 80 years had passed like the pause between heartbeats, they sat not in a control room, but in a graveyard without tombstones, a place where failure was remembered in claw marks, and life had endured through a loyalty so profound it could not be named. "Do you believe him?" Ava asked, her voice cracking, not from cold, but from the weight of everything she had seen. Elias nodded, slowly, each movement carrying the gravity of belief hard-earned. "I believe him," he said, "and I believe in Fenrir." Outside, beyond the hull, in a wind so thin it felt like memory itself, a howl rose from the deep distance, not of pain, not of rage, but of warning. Like a bell tolling against the walls of history, it echoed through the frost, a reminder that some truths must remain buried, not because they are unworthy of knowing, but because humanity is not yet worthy of knowing them. The following day, the team shifted their focus to the ship's underdeck, the cargo hold and logistical bay, sealed off from the rest of the vessel by 2 thick plates of steel, fused and stamped with the faint black insignia of the SS. Marcus knelt in the frost and brushed away the ice that clung stubbornly to the doorframe, revealing an inscription carved in deep German lettering. "Nur der Tod kann den Schlüssel tragen." Only death may carry the key. Elias exhaled slowly, the weight of those words pressing against his ribs. "We were never meant to be here." Ava placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "But we are here. Now." It took nearly 6 hours to open the door. The thermal drill had to be tuned to within a fraction of a degree to avoid cracking the ancient insulation. When the final layer fell away, it revealed a dark chamber, sunken in silence. The air inside was heavy, so thick it felt as though each breath drawn into their lungs might belong to a soul that had waited far too long to be released. Flashlights pierced the darkness, and then they all stopped. Frozen. Speechless. At the center of the cargo bay, ringed by rusted supply crates and sacks of mildewed fabric, stood a box. Not made of wood, not forged from metal. Stone. A monolith of obsidian black, polished to a mirror sheen, so dark it swallowed the light, and upon its surface were etched markings, neither symbols nor letters, neither art nor language. They were something else. A code, a geometry, a message from a mind that did not think like ours. Ava stepped forward, her breath trembling. She shone her beam across the carvings, then reached for her portable scanner, technology born of 21st century precision, and held it to one corner of the stone. The device beeped once, then fell silent. No match found. No record in any known linguistic system. Egyptian, Sumerian, Greek, none. "Not from any civilization we know," she whispered. Elias leaned down beside her, saying nothing, but his eyes, wide and haunted, betrayed what his voice could not. He had seen something like this before. Long ago, in the forgotten caves of Alta, where 40,000-year-old paintings clung to stone, unclassified, unnamed, and untouched by explanation. Marcus, keeping to the edge, scanned the room. And then he stopped. "Thermal alert," he murmured, staring at the monitor. But that can't be. The air around them read -42 degrees Celsius, but the surface of the stone box was warm. +5 degrees Celsius. No power source, no heating coil, no chemical reaction, just warmth. Like breath. It's alive, Ava whispered, not as a hypothesis, but as a truth she felt in her bones. They placed their hands upon it, just for a moment, and each of them felt it, a pulse, so faint, so deep, it seemed to come from within the earth itself, not violent, not urgent, but steady, like a heart. Ancient. Unending. Elias turned to her. "We haven't found an object. We've found a presence." Ava nodded. "It could be a technology. It could be biological. It could be a memory." Marcus circled slowly, one hand resting on his sidearm by instinct, not intention. He stopped when something small slid across the floor, carried by a stray draft from the open hatch. A thin metal card. He picked it up. Etched upon it, in stark, chilling clarity, Führerbefehl, nicht öffnen, niemals. Supreme command, do not open, ever. Elias sank to the floor, head in his hands, as though the realization itself had weight. "I understand now," he whispered. They weren't transporting an artifact. They weren't studying it. They weren't in control. They only did one thing. He looked up, his voice hollow. "They buried it." Ava stared at the stone, her eyes filled with something close to mourning. "And left it, to the dogs, to guard the truth from us." Then, a sound, software barely audible, but unmistakable. Breathing, not from any of them, from inside the box. All three stood still, their own breath caught in their chests. Elias stepped back. His eyes locked on a single mark at the center of the lid, a circle entwined with a mirrored spiral like a DNA strand, but inverted, twisted against nature's design. He whispered, "It's not something we understand. And it's not something we should." Ava didn't blink. "I don't think it's a weapon," she said. "I think it's a memory." Elias turned. Whose memory? And Ava, eyes fixed on the living stone, answered without hesitation, "Not human." The wind outside began to howl, louder now, as if something ancient had sensed its seal weakening. Fog rolled in, thick and sudden, slipping through every seam like fingers pressing through the cracks of forgotten doors. And then, Fenrir 01 appeared, at the hatch. It didn't bark, it didn't growl, it simply stood there, watching. Its golden eyes gleamed like twin moons caught in eclipse, fixed not on the humans, but on the box. Elias stepped toward it. "You don't need to guard it anymore," he said gently. But Fenrir didn't move. Ava whispered, "No." "It knows. We're not ready. And maybe we never will be." The black stone remained closed. But with every passing minute, the air grew warmer, as if it had begun to wake. Outside, in the ever-whitening world, a new patrol began. Fenrir 01 turned, walked into the snow, each step a promise. And they, the scientists, the explorers, the bearers of modern knowledge, stood in silence, not before an artifact, but before a sealed gate forged from stone, from memory, from guilt, and from a primordial fear that still had no name. Because behind that door was not death. It was something alive, older than history, deeper than the nature of man, and should even one soul open it, memory would cease to be something we study. It would become something we run from. The cargo hold fell into a silence so complete, so consuming, it felt as though the last breath in the world had escaped from within that stone chest, and the air around them dared not stir again. No one spoke. No one moved. as if the mere scrape of a boot or a whispered word might be enough to summon a reality that could not be sent back, to unlock a door that would never close again. And then, Fenrir 01 stepped in. There was no growl, no bark, no frantic sprint. Only presence, solid as rock, still as midnight, and ancient as the very relic it had guarded for 80 unbroken years. Ava slowly lowered her flashlight, her gaze drawn to those golden eyes, bright, bottomless, and strangely unnatural in the way they did not reflect light, but absorbed it like an aperture opening into something far beyond comprehension. Elias stood beside her, his voice nearly inaudible. "He didn't come here to attack." Fenrir 01 walked past them one by one. No eye contact, no hesitation. It approached the stone chest, bowed its head slightly, and touched the edge of it with its nose, so gently it might have been a whisper across time. Just one touch, nothing more. And then it turned and walked away. Ava watched it go, a tightness forming in her chest, as if she had just witnessed something sacred. "That was a ritual," she murmured. Elias turned to her, brow furrowed. "A ritual for what?" Ava didn't answer immediately. She stepped forward, placed her hand gently where Fenrir's nose had touched. It was still warm, but not the same. "Fenrir didn't guard the stone to protect us," Ava said softly, eyes never leaving the black surface. "They didn't stay out of loyalty to humans, not out of obedience to military command, not for ideology." She turned to Elias, her voice firmer now, conviction rising like something long buried. "They preserved balance." Elias narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" "We thought Fenrir were guard dogs, programmed warriors, but they weren't. They were created, or chosen, to be wardens." She pointed toward the perimeter where those perfect patrol loops had been carved into the snow, year after year, generation after generation, without a single deviation. This wasn't training. This was inherited memory. Behavior stored not in muscle, but in blood. In instinct deeper than anything human science could ever reach. Elias nodded slowly, the weight of understanding settling across his shoulders. "We believed we were the authors of history," he murmured, "but maybe there are beings that exist only to ensure we never tamper with the parts we were never meant to write." That night, Ava sat alone outside the hold. Wind howled between the rusting antennae. Snow danced like ash in the beam of her light that caught nothing and everything. Fenrir 01 returned, but this time it did not come close. It remained at a distance. It simply watched. Quiet, heavy with something she couldn't name, and in those golden eyes, Ava saw it. Loneliness, not the loneliness of abandonment, but the loneliness of something that had seen too much, known too much, and remained even after everyone else had left. The next morning, Elias brought Ava a file, yellowed and brittle, from the restricted military archives he had copied in secret before leaving Berlin. Inside, there was a handwritten note, no author listed, no classification seal. Fenrir was not born in a lab. They were chosen, from those with the calmest temperaments, the highest intelligence, but something else. Something different, as if they could sense what we could not. In every trial, FK901 was given two choices, attack or retreat, but it always chose a third, wait. And when placed near the stone chest, it did not leave. It did not eat. It did not sleep. It did not die. Ava finished reading, and something within her clenched, something that had no name. "Waiting isn't a behavior," she whispered. "It's a state, a role, and Fenrir, for 80 years, has lived a role that no one recognized and no one understood. That afternoon, as the research team continued scanning for temperature variations within the stone chest, they made a chilling discovery. There was no longer any energy signature, no warmth, no cold, no pulse, as if it had been appeased. Elias looked towards the exit hatch. Fenrir 01 was no longer there. Only its paw prints remained, clear, steady, unwavering, leading out into the snow. Ava followed them to the edge of the northern ice forest, where the fog swallowed the world. She stopped. She didn't call out. She simply stood there, staring into the vast unknown, into the place where something had walked away, continuing its watch over a truth mankind was still not ready to face. "Thank you," she whispered. Not like one speaks to a dog, but like one says farewell to a soul that had kept the world in balance, long before we even understood that balance was needed. Fenrir was never just a dog. Fenrir was living memory, the eyes of an ancient order, and those eyes, though no longer here, are still watching. The Arctic wind still howled, relentless, unwavering, though the sun no longer dared to climb high into the sky. It hovered just above the horizon, casting no warmth, only a pale, silver whisper across the snowfields, like the delicate shroud of a forgotten spirit stretched thin over a land too silent for human hearts to endure. Ice groaned faintly in the distance, brittle cracks threading through its ancient blue depths, and from far across the frozen plain, the ground itself seemed to breathe, slowly, deeply, not with the rhythm of anything alive by human measure, but with a pulse older than time, deeper than memory. That afternoon, Ava sat in the control tent, eyes fixed on the thermal imaging feed streaming in from the network of sensors and cameras positioned around the wreckage and the sealed cargo hold. For the first 12 hours, there had been nothing. Just clustered signatures from the team, static cold, lifeless and expected. But then, at precisely 3:12 a.m., something appeared. A dim red blot, subtle, software but moving. It stirred beneath the ice floor, not fast, but steady, and it moved in spirals. Ava zoomed in, her fingers cold, not from the air, but from a sudden visceral knowing. This was not a creature, not an animal. It had no limbs, no edges, no core, just a shape of heat, blurred, breathing, deliberate, and it was rising. Toward the surface. Elias was summoned at once. He sat for a long while before the screen, arms folded, eyes distant, as if listening not to the data, but to a voice only he could hear. Something speaking across decades, across silence. "Whoever was buried," he said, his voice dry as frost, "is waking. Or maybe that thing we think is stirring is only an echo. Maybe the true presence left the stone a long time ago." Marcus stood at the radar station, scanning communication frequencies, when he noticed something wrong. All channels had begun to distort. Frequency 144.50, static. Frequency 190.00, low, rasping surges, like breathing stretched thin through old wires. Internal channel, collapsing. Voices of the team flickering, broken, then gone. Moments later, a new sound emerged. Not language, not voice, just a low-frequency pulse, repeating, slow, like a heartbeat. At 17:03, Ava collapsed. She had been in the control tent, transcribing the latest energy readings from the monolith, when her body went rigid, her heart rate spiking to 140, skin drenched in sweat, her breath locked behind a wall of nothingness. Marcus reached her first, lifting her into the makeshift medical bay. The monitor showed no external stimuli, no chemical trigger, No physical trauma, no allergy, no stress, only the body reacting. A few minutes later, Ava sat upright, pale, shaking, but aware. She looked at Elias. Her voice was weak but certain, each word carved from something deeper than fear. "I didn't hear anything, but someone whispered in my head, 'I am still here.'" Elias didn't flinch. "Artifacts don't need to speak in words," he said quietly. "This thing, it moves beneath language. It doesn't need to be opened by hand. It only needs to be remembered. Long enough, deep enough." He turned to her, eyes sharp with the kind of warning that feels like prophecy. "And you've looked at it for too long." That night, the thermal monitors around the cargo bay recorded an anomaly. The temperature began to rise. From minus 40 degrees Celsius to minus 25 degrees Celsius in 4 hours. No heat source, no leak, no generator, just the ice, beginning to melt. Marcus proposed sealing off the bay, but Elias shook his head slowly. "If it could be stopped by barriers," he said. "Those who came before us would have succeeded." Ava rose. Her breathing was steady now. Her voice was steel. "I want to go back down there," Marcus objected. But Elias nodded. "Go, but not with lights, not with scanners or cameras. Bring only your instinct." At 23:19, Ava and Elias re-entered the cargo hold. The stone monolith remained still, but the ice beneath them was damp now, coated in a thin, glistening layer of water, silent and glass-like, reflecting more than light. Reflected in it were their own silhouettes. And one more, not theirs. Its shape was uncertain. Blurred. But it had eyes, and those eyes looked back. Elias stepped closer to the monolith. Slowly he knelt, lowering himself like a man at confession. His voice was quiet, not submissive, not pleading, just human. "We are not enemies," he said. "We are only lost." Ava stood beside him, her hand resting on the lid of the monolith. It wasn't cold, nor warm. It was breathing. A long, low, steady pulse, felt not with ears, but through skin, through spine, like a resonance tuning their bodies to something vast, ancient, and unseen. Outside, for exactly 3 minutes, the Arctic wind stopped. Total silence. The exterior cameras captured it. The entire pack of Fenrir had returned, 9 of them. They did not enter. They formed a circle. They sat. They stared at the cargo bay. No howling, no movement, just presence. Living statues in a ring of watchful silence. Guardians of something deeper than truth. Watchers of a secret not meant for human eyes. Inside the dim, frost-covered chamber, Ava whispered, her voice barely more than breath, her eyes glistening, not with fear exactly, and not quite sorrow either, but with something older, something wordless, as though a memory she never lived was surfacing through her blood. I feel like it's remembering." Elias turned to her, his face shadowed with concern. "What is?" Her answer came cracked, thick with emotion that didn't belong to this moment alone. "The world before us. Something long forgotten, and it doesn't want to come back." But beneath their feet, the ground was trembling. Not violently, but slowly, deliberately. Something was moving beneath the ice, not rising but drifting, horizontally, as though a being was carving its way through solid frost, not to surface, but to bypass, to find another way. Elias stepped back, his heartbeat thundering like a warning from within. His voice broke as he looked at Ava, horror dawning in his gaze. "What if Fenrir wasn't guarding the chest?" He turned to her fully now, eyes hollow with dread. "What if It was stopping something else from finding a way out. And now, that something had begun to stir. Outside, the 9 Fenrir remained in their silent circle. Still, ancient, unshaken. They knew. They had always known. And now, finally, humanity understood. Not all memories are meant to be unearthed. Some, if returned, will not call our names. They will call the name of the price. As morning light crept quietly across the gray snow like a thin blanket laid over a sleeping world, Elias reopened the journal of Captain Franz Albrecht. Not searching for answers now, but for warnings. Clues buried in pages no one had ever read to the end. Page 27. The ink had partially bled from condensation. But the last line remained, etched deep as if written not with ink, but with the weight of final breath. Schmidt never came back, but his footsteps were there, leading one way, and beside him, something left marks. Not wolf, not bear, no claws, no paws, just 2 deep impressions in the snow, as if it stood for hours, unmoving, just watching. Across from him, Ava sat pale from exhaustion. She hadn't slept, not after what she saw in her dreams. White snow, endless silence, and a tall, thin shadow standing still, just a few dozen paces away. At midday, the survey team returned to the western quadrant of the wreck, the area noted in the journal as Schmidt's last known location. The night wind had stripped away the top layer of frost. And there they were. 2 impressions. Unlike any known animal, only 2 smooth, oval hollows. Deep, precisely spaced, roughly shoulder width apart. But the edges were too sharp, too perfect, as if whatever stood there had no flesh, no skin, only pressure, raw and unfiltered, like a presence so dense it carved matter by stillness alone. Elias measured the spacing, 1.73 meters, exactly the average height of a European male. But the weight required to leave that depth would have been double. Ava knelt beside the mark. She did not touch. She only hovered her hand above, letting her body register what her mind could not explain. No drag marks, she whispered. No heel lift. No shift in balance. It didn't move. Elias looked into the empty white in front of them, his voice soft, almost reverent. So it stood here, all night, watching the ship. Just watching. Marcus arrived last, carrying a handheld magnetic resonance sensor. He began to sweep the area around the impressions. Suddenly, the device vibrated. Hard. A spike. On the screen, a burst of magnetic turbulence appeared. Violent. Erratic. As if some colossal electronic force had once stood precisely at that spot. But there was no metal, no heat signature, no radiation, only residue. The aftershock of a presence not made of matter, but heavy as if carrying centuries of silence and intent, a weightless thing that still pressed into the earth like a soul too burdened to lift. Elias stood frozen. Fenrir never left, he said softly, but something else came. Nightfall was swift. In the command room, interference flooded the communication lines again, but this time it wasn't static, not howling, not chaos. It was a signal. A steady, deliberate series of pulses. Morse code. Ava was the first to catch it. She jotted down the patterns, translated them into letters. The message was simple. 1 sentence. I've been waiting for you. Just a statement. Flat. Certain. As if it had been composed long before the team ever arrived. As if humanity's return had been nothing more than a box on an old calendar, already accounted for. Elias exhaled, the truth chilling his lungs. "We didn't unearth it," he whispered. "It let itself be found." Ava turned to him, her voice trembling. "Do you think the thing that stood next to Schmidt in 1943 is the same thing that left these marks?" Elias was silent for a long time. Then finally, with a weight that bent every word, "No, I think it never left." And then the lights in the main hold flickered. Camera feeds outside the station glitched. Ava froze one frame, 0.7 seconds. There, at the far edge of the screen, stood a shape. Tall, still, faceless, no head, no arms, no definition. Just a silhouette, an absence shaped like attention. And it was looking straight into the lens. Marcus took a step back, his chest rising and falling as if something inside him was being pulled. Not with fear, but with recognition. A memory he never lived, whispering as if it belonged to him. Ava didn't blink. She spoke slowly, not to anyone in the room. "We're asking the wrong question." Elias looked over, confused. Ava turned toward him, her gaze bottomless like a chasm filled with time. "Not, what is it, but what does it want from us?" Outside, the 9 Fenrir had not moved. The wind shifted direction. And deep beneath the snow, something was waiting to be remembered. 3:19 a.m. The Arctic night was so utterly silent that even the soft rhythm of a human heartbeat seemed to echo within the thin walls of the temporary research station, as if the air itself had grown heavy enough to carry the weight of things unsaid. Inside the tent, the cold blue pulse of biometric sensors blinked in even intervals, quiet, methodical, like lullabies for sleeping machines. Everyone was asleep, or at least trying to convince their restless bodies to rest. All except one. One man unzipped his sleeping bag, unlocked the tent door, and stepped into the snow. No sound, no word. Dr. Reuben Hale, neurologist, theorist, the man who once wrote his doctoral thesis on the psychological consequence of confronting phenomena beyond human comprehension. And now he understood. It wasn't that the artifact defied comprehension. It was that comprehension was never what it wanted. He walked with strange steadiness through the snow crust, boots leaving dark indentations behind him. His eyes were open, but distant, as if focused on a place no one else could see. In his hand, clutched tightly, was a single slip of paper. It had been written in his own hand. While dreaming. I saw the light beneath the ice. I heard my voice, but it wasn't mine. I remember, though I've never lived there. 3:31 a.m. The cargo bay's internal camera captured the exact moment Reuben arrived. He didn't sit, he didn't speak, he simply touched the monolith. And the monolith responded. A vibration rippled through the floor, not like sound, but like a thought made physical, a presence shaping matter into meaning. Fine cracks formed around the base of the stone, barely visible, like the delicate trails of bird tracks in untouched snow. Then, for a few brief seconds, a thin groove of light shimmered along the surface of the black stone, then vanished. Reuben's breathing quickened, his pupils dilated, his lips began to move. "I remember now," he murmured. "I've stood here before man, before memory. I am part of it. We all are. What's left of us was always part of it." His hand traced the glowing line, the same place where Blake had once reached. The monolith began to open. Far away, Ava awoke, bolt upright, her chest constricted, a shiver raced down her spine, and then a howl. Not loud, not feral, just a single sound, cutting the line between sleep and wakefulness, like a blade of memory through fog. She ran. Toward the cargo hold. Toward the monolith. Inside, Reuben was already gripping the edges of the lid. His eyes no longer saw. His mouth moved, but not with language. He was chanting. Something that was not words, not shaped by any alphabet, yet flowing in rhythm, like a litany passed down through silence rather than speech. A prayer from a world that had already been forgotten. "Reuben!" Ava screamed. "Let go!" No response. She stepped forward, and then Fenrir 01 appeared, not from the door, not through the corridor, just there, as if it had stepped out from the fracture in the air itself. It didn't growl, it didn't bark. It moved, swift, precise, a blur of will and muscle, and hurled itself into Reuben, striking him square in the chest, toppling him backward. Reuben hit the ground. His hands fell away from the stone. At that very instant, the line of light on the monolith vanished. Ava rushed to him, cradling his head. He was unconscious. Cold sweat gleamed on his brow. And on the surface of the monolith, his handprint still glowed, for a moment. Then faded. Fenrir stood before it, head bowed, eyes glowing gold, watching the crack. And then, slowly, it placed its two front paws upon the lid, and closed it. Not with force, only with presence. Ava trembled. She turned to Elias, who had just arrived, his breath catching at the edge of words. "He didn't do this himself," she said. "It wasn't Reuben. Something inside is choosing. It's searching for someone to open it for them." Elias looked at Fenrir. His voice was hoarse. "And he's the only one still standing between us and that door." Morning. Reuben awoke. He remembered nothing. But in his personal journal, on the final page, a line had been written. Not in any known language. No one could translate it, except Fenrir. Because the moment Elias held up the notebook, Fenrir 01 turned and growled. Not with anger, but with urgency. A growl like a last sentinel warning the world that memory was rising, that the floodgates of something unspoken were loosening, and that it would not be contained by human science or logic. The artifact was no longer dormant. It was choosing. But Fenrir still stood guard, still pulled them back, still held back the tide of memory that could drown a century, even if it had to stand alone, even if it had to defy history itself. That night, the sky above the Arctic did not move. Not because the cold deepened, but because time itself seemed to pause, as if the threads of past and present had begun to twist, folding into one another, erasing the lines between waking and dreaming, between what had been and what was being summoned. And Elias Granger, the man who had spent his entire life chasing shadows of history, found himself stepping, for the first time, into history itself. He sat alone in the command tent, eyes unfocused, gazing through the frost-covered window at Fenrir 01 patrolling the edge of the snow. His eyelids grew heavy, his pulse slowed, not like falling asleep, but like descending, sliding downward into a memory that had never been his, but waited for him nonetheless. When he opened his eyes, he was not Elias Granger. He was Franz Albrecht, Captain Lieutenant of U-Boat Y, 2025, November 1943. The air was thick with the scent of rust and engine oil, the clatter of mechanical clocks, the slow groan of ice pressing against steel. His hands gloved in black leather. Around him, faces he knew yet did not. Officers, crewmen, a still German shepherd in the corner, unmoving, and the monolith, unchanged, but now it was cracked. Franz, or Elias, stepped to the command table. A notebook lay open, the final page half written. It was his handwriting, but he didn't remember writing it. I feel it is speaking through me, not in words, in images, flowing through my blood. I have seen the earth break open. Man forget man. Beast forget fear. A faint sound rang out, a small thud from the deck. Franz turned. A crewman had collapsed, eyes open, heart still, no scream, no panic, just silence. Death not by violence, but by something he remembered too well. Franz looked around, and every man was staring at the black monolith. And no one ran, and no one screamed. It was their eyes, eyes that looked as though something had just been pulled from the back of their memory, dissected in front of them under clinical light, and forced upon their souls with the cold demand, "This is the real story." One young officer, hands trembling, voice brittle, managed to say what they were all thinking. "We shouldn't be bringing it back." Franz turned to him. "No," he said, calmly, firmly, with the weight of a man who had long since let go of personal hope. "We were never meant to bring it back. We were chosen to bury it." The room grew darker, but it wasn't because the lights had dimmed. It was because the light itself was retreating from the world. Franz stepped forward toward Fenrir 01, who at that time was still young, strong, silent, unaware of the eternity it had been appointed to carry. Franz knelt down, placed his hand on the creature's head, his voice no longer belonging to a man, but to a memory speaking through him. "You won't understand it all," he said softly, "but you'll remember." Then he returned to his desk and wrote the final line of his journal. "We were wrong to think we were the last sentinels. The truth is, we were only the first to fall." He stood and walked into the control chamber. He pulled the lever. The seals locked. The ship closed around them. Through the porthole window, the Fenrir had already formed a circle around the artifact. And then Franz, who was also Elias, opened his eyes. He was lying in the tent. His breathing was sharp. His body was ice. But the tears streaming down his cheeks were warm. Ava sat beside him. She gripped his hand tightly. "What did you see?" Elias didn't speak at first. The dream clung to him like a second skin. Then, in a voice quiet as breath against frost, he whispered, "I lived another man's death, but the fear was my own." He looked past her, into the dim, whirring machinery of the tent. "And in that dream, everything was clear. It's not the past returning, it's the present, being absorbed into it." Ava didn't respond. Across the snow, Fenrir 01 approached in silence. It sat beside the tent, still, watching Elias, not blinking, not moving, as if it too had seen the dream. Inside the tent, silent as a grave, cold as memory, Elias slowly lowered his hand to the frozen ground and whispered, "We are not haunted by what has died. We are living among what was never born." No one responded, because everyone was beginning to understand, not through logic, but through something deeper, something older, a tightening in the chest, a shiver in the spine, a silence that crept into the hollow's language could not reach. By morning, the tension had crystallized, not into arguments, not into raised voices, but into eyes that no longer met one another without trembling beneath the weight of unsaid truths. Marcus was the first to speak. "We've come this far. We opened a door others buried, and if we don't continue, then what was this journey for?" Elias said nothing, but Ava did. "This journey," she said slowly, like each word cost her something. is a warning, rewritten in cold blood. Reuben, who had once lost control near the artifact, now found himself siding with Marcus. He couldn't remember every detail, but something inside him burned with conviction. To deny the past does not erase it. "We're standing at what might be the edge of human understanding," he said. "If we don't learn what this is, then we will forever be led by fear." Ava sat beside Fenrir 01, her hand brushing lightly over his back. Not in comfort, but in recognition. She knew the creature wasn't there to be reassured, but to warn. "There are things," she said, her eyes fixed on the white beyond the tent, "that were not made for us to understand." The room fell silent again. So long that the cracking of distant ice could be heard. A sound familiar in the Arctic, but now it rang like something deeper, a fracture in history itself. Elias rose. He unrolled an old wax map of the Arctic, edges worn soft by time. "I used to believe," he began, "that if we ever touched something truly unknown, it would bring joy." He pointed at the circled mark, Y2025. "But now I understand. Sometimes knowledge isn't light. It's a furnace." Helena, quietest of them all, spoke. "If we turn back, will it sleep again?" No one answered, because they all knew it was already awake. Ava rested her hand against Fenrir's neck. He held the door for 80 years. She looked around the room, her voice no longer quiet. "And we've only been here 10 days, and already believe we deserve to open everything?" Reuben's voice broke for the first time, low and sharp. "So what are you saying? We walk away? Delete everything? Pretend none of this happened? What if someone else comes, and there's no Fenrir left to stop them?" Ava turned toward him, her gaze steady. "No. Exactly because I fear that we must not be the first to make that mistake." Outside, the wind returned. Stronger now, sharper, biting. A rush of white swept through the tent flap, whirling snow and frost, and carried with it a single dog's hair, drifting softly, landing in Ava's palm. She held on, tight, not to protect herself, not out of fear, but as if her hands alone could keep reality from slipping further into the threshold of the unknowable. And then Elias stepped forward, past the line of silent bodies, and into the stillness where all decisions are made. His voice didn't rise, didn't thunder, but it carried weight, like the first voice in a forgotten temple, remembering how to pray. "In the beginning," he said, "when humankind first discovered fire, we didn't know whether it was light or death, and yet we stepped forward." He turned, his eyes glinting not with fear but memory. "But fire belonged to this world." He raised his hand, pointing toward the frozen hulk of the submarine, the monolith buried beneath ice and silence. "This does not." Silence fell like snowfall, long, still, reverent. "And then," Elias continued, his voice now quieter but carrying something final, "we will not erase the data, we will not bury the truth, but we will not be the ones to open the last door." Marcus looked at him, eyes no longer filled with resistance, but something softer. "Then what do we do?" Ava stood. Her voice was steady. "We let Fenrir do what he's done for the last 80 years. She knelt beside Fenrir 01, leaned close, her breath fogging against his black fur. "And this time," she whispered, "we'll stand guard. With you." 4 days later, they left the site. The artifact wasn't destroyed because no one was sure it could be. Instead, it was sealed, not with code or key, but with the most ancient material of all: time. frozen again beneath layers of glacial sediment and biotitanium composite, a blend Ava herself had designed. No access codes, no entry mechanism, no future hands meant to open it. Only the passage of centuries would dare touch it. The black monolith lay there, silent, no longer warm, no longer glowing. But inside, no one knew. Had it fallen into slumber, or had it closed its eyes only to listen to us, one final time? On the day of departure, the 9 Fenrir stood in formation, solemn sentinels in snow, their eyes unreadable, eternal. And one, Fenrir 01, turned, alone, walked back toward the wreck. No music, no last words, just one final glance over his shoulder, full of understanding and sorrow. In the helicopter that lifted them back through the Arctic haze, Elias sat by the window, watching the white fade beneath them, slow as a farewell that knows it will never be answered. "Will we ever come back?" Marcus asked. Elias didn't respond immediately. He stared at the endless frost line for a long moment, then spoke, not to Marcus, not to the team, but to the horizon. "Only when humanity learns how to bow," he said softly, not in fear, but in gratitude. But gratitude alone could not stop the wind. It could not hold back the snow. It could not halt nature from fulfilling its oldest duty, to blur the lines between mankind and the smallness we so often forget we are. By the time Elias finished that sentence, they were already 300 feet above ground. The edge of the station blurred into a shroud of white that stretched forever, as if the land itself refused to let them leave untouched, as if it had marked them, each of them, carrying something undefined, something unspoken. And because that something had no name, the ice would demand it back. The storm came without warning. No satellite alerts, no pressure shifts, just rupture. The sky tore open, and the wind screamed like something ancient and betrayed. Snow turned to crashing waves of white fury, hammering the helicopter, lashing radar towers, slamming into the earth with the wrath of a century buried too long. The pilot shouted orders through the radio, but all that came through were howls, static and wind, wind and static. The helicopter turned back. The research team scrambled toward the temporary station, no longer a retreat, but a bunker. No one asked what they were facing, because by now questions had become meaningless. Every step forward was a wager with death. That night, the storm became ritual. Snow pounded the tin roof like nails on a coffin lid. Power failed for 3 hours. All radios turned to static. Oxygen monitors blinked in erratic sync, recording, for the first time, simultaneous heart irregularities across the entire team. No one slept. No one breathed evenly. No one raised their voice. Then the ground trembled. Not thunder, not the groan of distant glacier collapse, but a low growl deep beneath them, as if something beneath the earth had stirred. And it was displeased. Marcus was near the outer corridor, where the wall was thinnest, where they'd mounted the lightest materials for sensor access. And in a blink, the floor collapsed. Part of the ceiling caved. A wall fell inward. A chasm opened beneath him like the throat of something starved. Ava screamed, her voice sharp enough to split steel. Elias and Reuben lunged, cords unspooling, arms outstretched. But Marcus was already waist-deep in the void, and whatever was pulling was not gravity. It was weight. The weight of something, not yet born. Elias dove. His hand gripped Marcus's wrist just as Marcus's eyes went wide. Not with fear, but as though something down there was looking back. No eyes, no shape, just the feeling of being seen. Together, Reuben and Helena pulled. 12 minutes of clawing, slipping, yelling through static and the grinding of ice beneath them. When Marcus was finally dragged free, his left leg had fractured cleanly. Blood spread across the snow, dark red against blinding white. But no one focused on the blood, because his body was cold, frozen, yet his forehead was drenched in sweat. Ava touched his brow. Marcus opened his eyes. He didn't say help. He didn't say pain. He whispered, voice barely above silence, "I saw a dream, but it wasn't mine. It was a memory of something that has no time." Elias said nothing. He sat in silence, the tilted beam of the flashlight casting a sliver of pale light across one side of his face, carving each wrinkle into a fissure, like cracks in old stone, not yet broken but ready to split with the gentlest pressure of time. The storm did not pass. It did not howl to frighten them, nor rage to scatter them. It remained, like a final test, a quiet sentinel in its own right, watching to see who they would choose to become. Because once you've crossed this far, once you've stepped beyond the edge of mankind's collective memory, survival no longer means escaping the cold or preserving your body. It means choosing to go further or to stop, to surrender not to death, but to a will far older and larger than your own. Ava sat beside Marcus, her hand wrapped tightly around his, her eyes red, not only from lack of sleep or from the shaking in her limbs, but because she knew, in a way she could not explain, that she was no longer a scientist. She was part of a ritual, a witness, a keeper of a vow never spoken aloud. "How much energy do we have left?" Elias asked softly. 18 hours, Helena replied. "Comms?" "Still out. Interference is too high. Winds reversing the magnetic field." Elias stared out the ice-crusted viewport, where the light from the station lanterns illuminated the snowfall like 1,000 small white spirits, swirling in a musicless waltz, encircling them without rhythm or end. "Then we have no choice," he said. Ava didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. She simply answered, "Our choice is not to let it choose for us." And so, in the midst of the storm, when death became something you could measure in the cracks of the ice and the rhythm of your heartbeat, they began to understand that survival was not the preservation of the body, but the preservation of will, that final spark of human freedom in the face of an artifact slowly waking into consciousness. And Fenrir, still circling the station in the outer dark, left behind footprints. Perfect, steady, patient, like a message, not to man, not to snow, but to the storm itself, to the artifact, to death, to the very concept of history. "I am still here, and I will not let you go farther than you should. Not if the sky collapses, not if the ice shatters, not even if life remains only in a single breath." That afternoon, the sun rose only a hand's width above the horizon, casting pale rays across the flattened snow that had carved the world into formless stillness, turning the research station into nothing more than a speck, lost in the indifferent white. And in that sliver of light, as it brushed across the command cabin, Elias opened the final page of the journal he had carried like a relic, gently, as if holding a piece of the world's forgotten soul. The ink was black, the handwriting slanted, faltering, written, perhaps, during the last shivering moments of pain or cold. Under the flashlight's trembling glow, the words became clear. "If you find this line, please do not open it. Let Fenrir guard it until the end of the world." Elias did not read the words aloud. He only placed his hand gently upon them, closed his eyes, and let each syllable fracture silently within his chest, like shards of glass that were once language, now turned into quiet blades of meaning. Ava stood behind him. She didn't speak. She had read that page yesterday, not with her eyes, but with something deeper, a form of understanding only possessed by those who have brushed against the edges of the unnamed and returned with silence pressed into their bones. Now, as Elias slowly closed the journal and sealed it inside a biocontainment case, not to hide it, but to memorialize it, Ava stepped outside. The wind had stilled. The snow no longer struck the canvas walls. It was as though the entire landscape had paused, listening. And there, on the northern ridge, where they had once erected a makeshift memorial for Franz Albrecht, the final captain of Y 2025, the man who had not abandoned his ship, his crew, or his memory, stood a single figure, Fenrir 01. It did not bow, it did not bark, it did not howl. It simply stood. Still, as though even the creature itself had long since ceased to be a living thing and become instead a monument, a sentinel, a vow in the shape of breath. Ava walked slowly toward it, each step sinking into the fine, powdery snow, each motion heavy, not with fear, but with reverence, because she wasn't walking toward an animal. She was walking toward a memory that had been awake for 80 years, without food, without sleep, without voice, only to watch, only to remember, only to guard. When she reached arm's length, the wind held its breath. No snow fell, no sound broke. And Ava whispered, "You did what none of us could. You kept something whole, something every one of us would try to explain away. You protected it not by understanding, but by never needing to." Fenrir turned, and in its gaze, there was no animal left. There was only a soul, one that had endured more than history and still chosen to remain. Because if it left, there would be no one left to remember that once. Someone gave everything so the rest of us could remain oblivious. Ava cried, not sobs, not trembling, just tears, quiet and steady, like condensation on cold glass, sliding free not because of grief, but because of knowing. Knowing that no amount of data, no statue, no report would endure as long as the footprints of Fenrir, circling again and again, like memory pressing itself gently into the skin of ice. Elias came next. He didn't speak. He didn't come close. He stood a short distance away, the sealed journal still in his hands, as if he now carried not just paper, but a soul with no name, no flag, no time, a soul that only nods to those who remain quiet enough to listen. Marcus, leg still in a brace, watched from the cabin's frosted window. And he whispered, "We are the living ones, and he is what survived." No one disagreed. Because in that white stillness, in the ice, in the wind, in the breathless space between words never spoken, Fenrir still stood. And beneath the snow, there was a man who did not die in fear, but chose to stay buried with a truth the world should never touch again. That night, Ava began writing her own journal. Nothing was archived. Nothing was transmitted back to Central Command. No digital records, no cloud storage, only a journal, handwritten. Line by line. Franz did not die from cold. He did not die from hunger. He did not die buried beneath ice. He died, so something else would not awaken. Fenrir was not made to obey, not a warhound, not a test subject, but the last primal instinct, to stop man from outgrowing himself. Ava closed the notebook. Outside, the wind howled, long, feral, ancient, as though mourning in a tongue the sky had forgotten. But inside the station, no one heard it anymore. because beneath that storm, deeper than sound, a new silence had settled. Not the silence of death, but the stillness of things whose purpose had been fulfilled. And Fenrir still stood on that mound of snow, unmoving, because perhaps when a soul has lived that long, it forgets what it means to leave. It only remembers this: I remain until the world learns how to be silent with gratitude. The ceiling began in a hush so absolute it felt almost ceremonial, as though even breath had to be measured, restrained, as though the frozen land itself was holding its breath, watching to see if mankind would once again reach too far, or, this time, bow its head and bury its curiosity beneath eternal snow. There was no debate anymore. After that night, after Fenrir's final glance from the snow-covered ridge, after the last line of Franz Albrecht's journal had been read aloud, they were no longer researchers, no longer seekers of truth with proud eyes and intellectual pride. They had become pallbearers of memory, not of bones, but of something heavier, something that, if unsealed, could unmoor an entire century, or worse, an entire age. Elias was the first to descend into Y-2025 that morning. He carried nothing but a steel hammer, a few scanning tools, and the journal, now resealed in an envelope of pressure-sensitive film. He brought it not to read it again, but to return it to where it had once been written. On the command desk, beneath the quiet flicker of a dying century. Eva followed behind, in silence, carrying a cryogel applicator, a biological substance designed to mimic polar-borne ice, dense and ancient. A reconstruction of purity, a mimicry of time itself, learned not through invention, but by watching what had always been stronger than them: nature. They didn't seal the submarine with force. They simply let the cold return. First, the gel spread over the joints of steel. Then the wind outside, sharper than knives, turned it to glass. Afterward, blocks of glacier ice were hauled from nearby ridges and laid over the hull, not with calculation, but with instinct, like hands laying stone over a grave not of flesh, but of knowledge. Marcus, still injured, still bound with splints, stepped outside anyway. He couldn't stand long, but he insisted. He would place the final stone. It was a block of ice, 40 kilos, squared and clean, etched with one line, by hand: Do not awaken what chose to remain behind. Helena crafted the marker. No statue, no monument, just a slab of deep black glacial rock, chiseled with a dull blade and smoothed by hours of meaningless effort, which was precisely why it felt true. No symbols, no emblem, no glory. Only these words, carved so deep even time would need centuries to erase them. A 2025-1943, not to be discovered but to be heard, not to be unearthed but to be remembered. When it was done, the snow returned. Gentle, inevitable, like forgiveness. It was as if the wind had approved, as if the land, once trembling beneath them, had finally exhaled. And Fenrir 01 still stood where he had always been. He had not moved, he had not howled, he had not looked away. And that, his presence alone, was enough. Every member of the team knew, in that quiet, that what they had done was not only seen, but accepted. Elias stood beside Ava on the outer platform, gazing back at the landscape, now buried, erased, as though Y-2025 had never risen, never broken through the veil of modern time. "Do you think," he asked, voice barely audible above the snow, "that one day the world will come back here?" Ava didn't answer at first. A breeze swept gently across her collarbone, and then she said, quietly, solemnly, "They will. I just hope By then, Fenrir's footprints are still there. And with that, they left. No one said goodbye. No one used the word forever. Because deep down they all knew permanence was never ours to hold. What humanity is given, if anything, is not dominion, but only the fleeting grace of each moment and the terrible freedom to choose, to protect something sacred, or to exchange it for the blinding glow of intellect stripped of soul. The day Y 2025 was sealed. There were no flags, no headlines, no speeches carved into stone. There was only a small group of people, silent beneath the sky, laying snow upon a vessel, and folding away a chapter of history that was never meant to be written. And a dog, still standing on the edge of the ridge, asking for no recognition, needing no name, only to be allowed to stay, in case watching must begin again. The final morning in the Arctic began like a curtain drawn across a stage where no actors remained, only the weathered props, silent and heavy with memory. A veil of white mist floated low, dressing the barren land in a stillness so complete it felt sacramental. Not a sound rose above the snowfall, and even the breath that left their lips felt hesitant, as though to speak too loudly would fracture the sacred quiet forged between earth and sky, between those who had witnessed survival, of a truth that never should have had a name. They stood, not in formation, not in rows, not under orders. 9 German shepherds, the final generation of Project Fenrir K9, stood like living statues in a world unpinned by time, a place where language had failed, where chronology had bent, where the only truth was what could be felt in the spaces between heartbeats. No one knew where they had come from. No one had seen them eat. No one had heard them howl. But everyone understood that each patrol loop, each silent amber gaze in the night, each footprint repeated like a prayer, had not been chance. It had been a promise, carried not in words but in breath, in blood, in fur passed down through generations that no longer belonged to any species, a legacy of watching, not for glory, not for reward, but because some truths demand guardians, who do not ask to be remembered. Fenrir 01 turned one last time. Its eyes drifted toward the endless white, not toward a destination, but toward something far older. Perhaps it was where they had come from, perhaps where they would return. But wherever it was, there would be no path, no map, no coordinates, because they did not need a way. They were the way. Elias stepped out from the station, his coat caught gently in the wind, his eyes tracking the footprints beginning to press into the snow. 9 shapes, moving neither in haste nor in harmony, but in a rhythm perfect in its repetition, tracing a path that had existed for 80 years, unbroken, unerring, unchanged by time. As though the universe had long since surrendered to the idea that some roads must remain as they were written, in the blood of the first death, in the cost of the first silence, in the warning of the first watcher. Ava stood beside him, saying nothing. She raised a hand to her forehead, not in salute, but in remembrance, trying to press into her memory this final image, the pack dissolving into the mist, no backward glance, no farewell. Only their tracks remained, threading across the frozen skin of the earth like a red stitch across white cloth, a thread that whispered only to those who had looked into the abyss of knowledge and returned. Changed. We have not forgotten. We do not sleep. We ask for no gratitude, we ask only this. Do not open it again. Marcus, still braced in his leg cast, stood alone on the ice, unable to hold back the tears, not because something had left, but because something sacred had simply withdrawn, not lost, not broken, just removed, so that mankind wouldn't mistake proximity for possession. And then, one by one, they vanished into the mist, simply returning as if they had never been here, as if it had all been a ripple in thought, a faint ringing in memory, a scratch across the glass of time. But when Elias knelt, he saw it. Still there. The footprints, each one deliberate, each one aligned, as though Franz Albrecht had just walked through moments ago, and the Fenrir K9 had followed him, step by step, only minutes behind. No one stepped on them, because everyone understood. Some things are honored not in words, but in the pause of a footfall held back. Ava took out her notebook, and for the first time she wrote not in science, not in data, but in farewell. There are names no one remembers, who nonetheless carried the soul of the world intact. There are beings who require no praise because their presence alone is sacred. Reuben closed the last data log. He powered on the station's camera one final time, sweeping it across the white void. Nothing remained, no shapes, no movement, only the snow trail, a thin thread of time, freshly stitched shut. That afternoon, they shut down the station. No photographs were taken. No signatures were left on the walls. They left behind only one thing, upon the recovered mound of snow, beside the black memorial stone of Franz Albrecht. A small sliver of hand-carved wood, its letters etched in old German script. Fenrir leapt. Fenrir lives. Feinpur. And then they left. The helicopter rose into the pallid sky, and not one of them looked back. But inside the cabin, no one closed their eyes, because somewhere beneath that fog-laced horizon, the footprints still walked. And they all knew, guarding is never a mission with an end. And those who guard without names, without medals, without orders, will always be there until we learn how to live as if protected by something we never deserved. Upon return, Elias Granger did not go home. He filed no report, spoke no words at briefings, made no declarations to governments or institutes. Instead, he requested solitude, 30 days of self-imposed isolation in an abandoned southern research station, a place without satellite coverage, without seismic scanners, a place no one had the patience to endure anymore, except a man who now carried a silence too vast to live again in a noisy world. There, among dry timber walls and broken shards of frost like fragmented memory, he wrote. Not on machines, not on encrypted drives, but by hand, on paper, with ink, and with fingers half frozen, writing like a man who knew time was short but still hoped that a few trembling lines might one day remain, for someone, or something, to read. The letter was never mailed. It was placed gently in an old tin box and buried beneath the black stone on Fenrir's final mound, under frozen earth, like a seed not meant to bloom, but meant to wait. Inside, in a hand that shook but did not break, Elias wrote, "To the one who will one day touch what we once touched, I do not know what year you are from. I do not know why you came. But if you're reading this, it means you've come close to the white zone. And the first thing I want to say is not a warning. It is an apology. I'm sorry we left traces. I'm sorry we weren't strong enough to erase every path. But please do not misunderstand. We tried. With everything we had. We did not run from truth. We simply tried to protect something the world was not yet kind enough to understand. Because the artifact beneath that ice, it is not a relic. It is not a source of power. It is not a gateway to intelligence or advancement. It is a living memory, the memory of a moment in time so ancient, even history itself chose to forget it. And within that memory lies a boundary, a line finer than breath, between what we call human and what should never have a name. We stood before it. We heard it breathe. We felt it move, not with limbs, but with will. And we chose to close the door. You may think we were cowards. You may believe walking away is weakness. But know this, some of the greatest battles in human history were the ones no one dared to fight. And if you ask who guarded this secret until now, follow the tracks, the footprints that never vanish, footprints not of guards, not of soldiers, not of governments, but of beings who never asked for our gratitude. They were not born to serve. They were born to protect us from ourselves. We called them Project Fenrir K9, but the truth is, they never needed a name. If you read this, I beg you, step back. Do not awaken what the ice has chosen to hold. Do not disturb the vow the dead still keep. And if you choose to go forward, know this, you will not walk alone. You may not see them, but they see you. They count every breath you take, and they are ready, again, to guard what the world should never possess. Elias set the pen down. The ink had dried. His hand trembled. He rose, put on his coat, took the small tin box in his hand, and walked through miles of snow beyond the edge of the station. And there, he saw him again. Fenrir 01. Still standing. At the edge of the horizon, he did not approach. He did not retreat. He only watched, toward the place where no one should walk. And his eyes were no longer the eyes of a dog. They were the eyes of the final sentinel, the last keeper of the threshold. Elias said nothing. He simply bowed his head. A small, wordless ritual by a man who had seen what could not be spoken and knew there was nothing more to do. But turn away. The letter has not been found. Fenrir 01 was never seen again. But the footprints, they remain, as if every winter since was only another layer of sealing. And in the endless winds that rake the polar wastes, if you ever listen, long enough, deep enough, humbly enough, you will hear it. The sound of breath, the rhythm of footsteps, the presence of a sentinel's watch. Not for the past, not even for the present, but for every generation yet to come. Beneath the layers of permafrost, in a silence so deep it feels like memory itself has fallen asleep, there lies something more than history. There lies reverence. For in that cold, sealed stillness, where recollection was not buried from fear but out of respect, dwell souls who were never named, beings who never sought legacy, who never needed thanks, and who chose to remain, quietly, at the edge of a line humanity was never prepared to cross. They, the nameless watchers, did not make their stand in declarations, but in stillness. They chose sacrifice as their language. They chose loyalty as their unspoken oath. And they chose unconditional love not as sentiment, but as purpose, an existence that stretched beyond species, beyond blood, beyond time. This story, wrapped in frost and haunted by unanswered questions, does not exist to frighten us. It exists to remind us, gently but unflinchingly, that there are some things in this world so achingly beautiful. They can only survive if we know when to be silent, when to take a single step back, and when to accept that not all power rests in our hands. Sometimes it rests in how we choose to live, not with dominance, but with decency. Learn to love, not only those who look like us, speak like us, or walk the same roads, but also those silent beings who walk beside us in shadow, who protect without praise, who are never known, but are always there. Live gently, not simply because the earth is warming, but because there are places, frozen, sacred, untouched, that deserve to rest. And there are lives, small, quiet, devoted, that are fighting even now to preserve a home for those who have not yet been born, and above all, live responsibly, not to be great, but so that you do not betray the quiet trust of the creatures who have chosen, without recognition or reward, to carry the weight of keeping this world whole, even when we ourselves have not yet learned to deserve it. Because somewhere, beneath the drifting veil of mist, there are still footsteps. Footsteps that have never stopped,